This is Kathy from Gadget321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Iroshizuku Chiku-rin. I'll be testing it in a variety of pins and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'm going to begin with the Extra Fine nib in a Pilot 78G Plus. This is a extra fine steel nib. It's not scratchy, but it's not smooth, even by extra fine standards. So I'm just going to put not scratchy. I wouldn't use that combination if I could avoid it, in other words. And in this extra fine nib, the read back with this kind of pale green ink is not the best, so just not a combination I'm fond of. Next, I have a Pilot Pereira with a fine steel nib. This Pereira is known for writing kind of dry, not putting down a whole lot of ink. And so this combination just feels dry. I don't like it. Alright, and it just has the same issues that the Extra Fine did. Since it's a pale ink, the read back for me is just not my favorite. Next, I have a Pilot Custom 74 with a 14 karat fine nib. Now, this is much better. This 14 karat fine nib puts down more ink than the steel nib did, so the read back is much better. I wouldn't call this smooth, but it's pleasant, so I'm going to say nice. That's one thing I like about this Custom 74. It's just a good pen. It's very forgiving with the inks. It's good for dry inks, wet inks. Alright, next I have a Quebeco Pacao all black with a medium nib. This feels a little dry, but it's still pleasant. And it just, since this ink has a tendency to demonstrate some really nice shading properties, it just really looks nice. It's nice to look at as you're writing, so I like that. This is usually the pen that I would use this ink with in my own personal use. Okay, next I have a Pilot Metropolitan with a cursive medium nib. This just feels a little too dry. It doesn't look bad, but this is dry to the point of being unpleasant. So I would tend to use the Pacao if I wanted to use this with a wider nib. Next, I've got my Moonman M800 with a Nemesign 0.6 stub nib. And this is a nice wet writing nib, so it works well with this pale ink. And I should have put smooth here. At this point, it's putting down enough ink with that wider nib. It's starting to feel pretty smooth. That's a pleasant writing experience. And finally, I've got a Ginhowe X750 with a 1.5 stub steel nib. All right. These pens, excuse me, I'm dipping them in ink, and I really needed to re-dip this one since it's such a wide nib. All of these pens, I've dipped them to do this writing sample, except for the Nemesign that I have in the Moonman. I've got the converter inked up. I'm going to re-dip this 1.5. Since it puts down so much ink, I really needed to re-dip it before I did this writing sample. So, let's try this one more time. See if we see a difference. Yeah, I think this is gonna, we'll see some more shading in this one. Okay. Now, while that dries, let's take a look at some writing samples on other papers. In my ARC notebook, I wasn't really fond of this. This is an absorbent paper. You notice it didn't absorb it, the ink, too quickly, like some inks tend to really soak into the paper. But just like on the writing sample that we just did, the finer nibs were just a little bit too fine. The Pereira felt nice, but that fine nib is just a little bit too fine. The Custom 74, I scratched out nice and put smooth. It was smooth, but I wouldn't call it a nice writing experience because this ink does tend to feather. The two nicest nibs were the Pacao and the Pilot Metropolitan. Actually, no, not the Pilot Metropolitan. It felt dry. The Pacao and the Nemesign was smooth, but these two, they just feathered and looked splotchy. That was kind of unusual. So I liked the quebeco pacao best for poor quality paper, the pacao, because it didn't write too wet and not too dry. Next, on Rhodia paper, some nice good paper, look at the two fine nibs. You can't hardly see that I've even written anything. The Custom 74 was nice. I think it was my favorite. Look at the color variation you see, or the line variation, and it was just nice and wet, so the ink is dark enough to read. The Pacao was pleasant. It felt kind of dry, kind of like on the Tomoe River paper, but it was pleasant. The Metropolitan, just like on Tomoe River paper, felt too dry. It was unpleasant. And the Nemesign was nice to write with. It was smooth. All right. On 20-pound copy paper, it was, look how quickly it absorbed into the paper. The fine nibs looked a little better than they did on some of the other papers, but they just felt anywhere from scratchy to just so-so. The Custom 74 was just okay because it was a little bit too wet. It looked splotchy. Surprisingly, the Pacao and the Metropolitan were the nicest to write with. Let's see. So this ink, it does tend to bleed through the paper. The finer nibs do a little bit better. The drier nibs do a little bit better, but even they bleed through a little bit. Okay. In my Leuchtturm Should have marked my page. Okay. On the Leuchtturm paper, we start to see that nice shading. Very nice. I like that. And let's see. I find that Iroshizuku Chiku-rin has the same degree of shading as Yuyaki. Iroshizuku Yuyaki. They're both, they work well in the same pen. So if you have a pen that works well with Yuyaki, it will work well with Chiku-rin and vice versa. All right. And you see, oh, just the nice shading in this ink. I liked it in the Nemesign, and I liked it in the Custom 74. The pacao, that was pretty nice too. It felt a little drier in the pacao, but it was still pleasant. Excuse me. Oh, I have a frog in my throat. So this is a nice ink, depending on if you get the paired up with the right paper and the right pen. It's a very pleasant ink. If you get it in the wrong pen, you know, it's a very unpleasant writing experience. And so I've heard a lot of people talk about how much they dislike Chiku-rin, and it's just because they don't have it in the right pen and using it on the right paper. All right. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.